Hi, this is Ben Cour, and you're watching Time to Connect.
Hey, Ben Delacour, thank you so much for taking the time to connect.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You bet. We've been trying to get this thing together for a while. We finally did it.
Hmm.
And you are not home. You're in a hotel in Houston, Texas. Is that right?
I am. I'm in a very nice hotel, much nicer than the kind that I'm used to staying at when I'm on the road.
Yeah, yeah.
So
And
yeah.
and you know, your bio is pretty fantastic. I've been reading a little bit about you and listening to your music uh, and you added it to it today by telling me that you're on the road with Lucinda Williams as her roadie, which just adds one
Yep.
more interesting wrinkle to your life. But you grew up in Brooklyn. Let's see, you were born though in London, is that right?
Yeah, I was born in London, but left when I was like 18 months old.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Grew up in Brooklyn. You've lived in Havana, Cuba, LA, New Orleans. Are you living in Nashville now?
Yeah, I've been in Nashville for the last 11 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
You you were a boxer. Uh,
Yeah.
And I would that be considered a semi-professional boxer, or how do you characterize that?
I mean, I was never professional. I was pretty seriously into amateur boxing though. So, I mean, my ultimate goal was like my dream was to kind of qualify for like the Olympics or something like that. And because that's until a couple of years ago, you could only enter the Olympics if you were an amateur. Um, they didn't allow any professional boxers to enter, and so that's what I was doing. And when I was living in Cuba, when I was 19, I was training with some of the people from the national team and just out there getting my ass kicked every day. It's great. It prepared
And
me well for doing music.
so, did you literally go down to Cuba to train as a
Hmm.
boxer? Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
how long you were there?
I was there about 8 months.
Uh-huh. And so, what led you to decide, I guess I'm not going to continue this pursuit?
Um, I kind of realized that I probably wasn't good enough to achieve what I wanted to do. And it was, it wasn't, I think one of my few good qualities is that being bad at something has never stopped me from doing it.
Hmm.
I'm very comfortable with being terrible at things if it matters to me.
Yeah.
It wasn't like I just boxed for a year or two and then was like, you know what, I don't think I'm good. I spent
Right.
5 or 6 years of my life completely immersed in that. And in boxing, it's not a casual sport. It's anytime you step in the ring, even for sparring, if you're not in shape and focused, like you can get, I got beaten up way worse and in sparring than I ever did in any of my fights, and
Really.
especially like when I was starting out in Brooklyn, I was like 13. It was a gym. I was like the only white kid in the whole gym. They were all like grown ass adults pretty much, except for maybe like one or two other dudes my age. And
Wow.
so it's like, yeah, and I don't know if I had much aptitude for it at the beginning, but I was like, I like this. I want to keep doing it. So, but I think I was 19 when I lived in Cuba, and I returned like a week before my 20th birthday, and I think it was like at a crossroads. And music had always been an important thing to me, and I'd always played in bands and written songs. And I actually got more into playing music when I was in Havana. I had some friends who were Cuban, and we go down to the Malecon and like the little seawall and play music for tourists and try to like hustle people and other nefarious activities. But it was kind of like I got back and I was like, no, music is what I want to do, you know. And so I was like, I know the kind of person I am, and like I knew I couldn't just be casually like into boxing training, and just do it for health things. It was like if I'm going to do it, I want to be in there. I want to be competing and stuff. And so I
Yeah.
kind of made a decision to, yeah.
And your music is obviously the main thing I want to talk about, but this is so fascinating. I do want to ask you one more question about it. What is it that drew you to boxing?
Um, so I was always got in a lot of trouble in school. Got in lots of fights and got
Okay.
in trouble for, you know, doing drugs and going to class, tripping on acid and stuff like that. And so I did karate for like a year when I was much younger, and the karate place closed down, and my dad was like, "Whoa, you like getting in, scraps so much and stuff. Like, why don't you?" It turned out there was a very famous boxing gym just a couple of miles from where I grew up, in Brooklyn. So I just got on my little BMX and went down there one day, and then just kind of never left.
Yeah.
So
Well, let's see. You've also been a bartender, janitor, agricultural worker. What kind of agricultural worker were you?
I worked on a dairy farm.
Uh-huh. Where was
Yeah,
that?
that was when I was living in the UK.
Okay.
Um, so I worked on I will only work there for 6 months or so, but I really enjoyed it. Honestly, it was one of my one of the jobs I disliked the least, you know,
hmm hmm
for
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
various.
And so you said that you were already writing songs and playing in bands and whatnot. So obviously you've been doing that for a while. How long ago did you say, I really want to do this? I want to make this my living. I want to make this my main thing that I do.
I mean, I think I always had dreams of doing it from when I could remember. I was always writing song. I come from my dad's a bass player. He wasn't a professional bass player or anything, but he always, I grew up with guitars in the house, and my mom,
Uh-huh.
a high school English teacher, so she kind of always um exposed me to like literature from a very young age.
hmm
And so I was always writing, like when I got a guitar, I didn't really want to learn any other people's songs. I was just like, how can I make my own songs?
hmm
And so, you know, before I got really into boxing, I was playing in like punk rock and metal bands with my brother. Um, like we used to play CBGB all the time when we were like 12, 13 years old. Um,
Wow.
and then that kind of took a back seat until I was 20. And then I was like, you know what? This is kind of my first love, and I'm gonna go for it, and I just knew I was gonna do it no matter what. It didn't matter how bad I was. It didn't matter, you know, I think any artist, you come up against so much rejection, but if you have that kind of, I feel like it's a manifestation of mental illness almost to like compulsively write songs, compulsively tour and play shows, even against his insurmountable odds that are, I mean, not insurmountable, but they feel like that,
Yeah.
especially early on, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, man, as cliche as it is, and it is cliche. People say, I can't not write. The only reason I do it is because I can't not. It's just true for some of us. I
Yeah.
don't care if it's cliche. I'm writing all the time, man. I'm sitting in line waiting for a meal or something, and lyrics are
Yeah.
popping up in my head, and you can't not do it. I've also spent a lot of time reading poetry. I'm going to guess you're a reader, and your mom's an English
Uh,
teacher, and I know I somewhere in an interview I know you mentioned On the Road, which I want to ask you about. But are you a pretty avid reader still?
yeah. I mean, I feel like I spend a lot more time reading than I do listening to music for sure.
Really?
Um,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
I kind of feel like in a lot of ways, temperamentally and otherwise, like I'm much better suited to being like
Yeah.
a writer. But also, I don't have that compulsive, you know, same thing with painting. I enjoy painting, but I mean, I know you're also a visual artist, and maybe your brain is kind of split more, but for me, it's like when I'm painting, and I paint a lot with my daughter too. I got a 6-year-old daughter, and we've always done a lot of art together.
Mhm.
And, but I don't have that urge to, set up the easel and get my acrylics out and paint all the time. Like I do have that urge, constant songwriting, like you say, it's always up there, you know,
Yeah.
and similar for me with writing. I sit down and I'll work on poetry quite a lot and or go through phases, and then I've been working on this, you know, for years, this kind of novel thing that doesn't seem to be, but again, I'll go through these spurts, so I'll write a bunch and then I won't touch it for 2 years, you know, and so I hope to get to a place down the line where I can, you know, dedicate myself more to that, but it's just, it's, so far my brain hasn't really come around to it yet, you know.
And
And
I'm sure that you are also like me, that even if you're not working on a song consciously, you're walking down the street and you hear someone say something, you hear a phrase, you go,
oh
ah,
yeah,
I
yeah,
like that phrase. I'm going to do that. In fact, Tom Waits did that a lot, and I wanted to mention that you've listed, either you yourself or other people have listed Townes, Van Zandt, Warren Zevon, Nick Cave, the Gun Club as influences. I definitely hear Warren Zevon for sure in a lot of your, especially your earlier or your stuff before this last
yeah, yeah,
wonderful album. But man, I hear Tom Waits in Birdcage. That
yeah,
that's
yeah.
almost like a Waits song. Are you conscious of that?
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoy Tom Waits a lot. That's kind of he's one of those artists that um I remember listening to through my parents from as far back as I can remember, you know,
Yeah.
and I'm definitely a huge fan of Tom Waits. That Birdcage song, actually, a lot of um the reason it came out that way was due to Jim White, who produced the record. And, you know, he I think comes from a similar place as Tom Waits, sonically at least, you know.
Yeah.
And so that song went through a lot of iterations. Like I wrote it almost as like we have a version somewhere that sounds almost like Kashmir by Led Zeppelin,
Oh,
you
really?
know? Yeah. And then he was like, we were both like, ah, this doesn't feel right, you know? And then so that song actually took the longest of any song on that record to get right, you know? And I knew that I didn't want to do like the Tom, you know, kind of Tom
Yeah.
Waits vocal on it.
Yeah.
Because that would be, you know, that would be pushing it past the point of a cliche. But I mean, definitely, I mean, Tom Waits is one of those people who's informed, you know, consciously or subconsciously,
Yeah.
you know, a lot of things that I do, and you know, I'm a huge fan of the way that he kept moving through his career. You know, personally, I always feel like I connected a little more with the pre-Swordfish trombones,
Yeah.
Tom
Me
Waits,
too.
you know, the
Me
kind of
too.
like. But I love everything. I mean, and Rain Dogs is like a pivotal album for me. I think I was like maybe 19 or 20 when I discovered that album, and I was, you know,
Okay.
my folks listened to a lot of the old Tom Waits, you know, and I was already a big Captain Beefheart fan when I kind of discovered that part of Tom Waits. So it kind of was all like, oh my God, this is, you know, all coming together in my head.
Right on. And you mentioned Jim. I definitely want to ask you about the Jim White connection, how all that happened, what it was like making that record with him. Before I do, since we're still on Waits, have you heard that story he tells about he didn't even know who Tom Waits was? He was in France maybe, and he wanted to buy some LPs for a friend, and he asked for recommendations in a record store, and one of them they gave him, I think it might have been Swordfish trombones, and he came home and he played it. The guy that he bought it for said, "Man, I don't dig this stuff. I don't know what this is." And Jim was like, "Okay, man, that's okay. I'll take it back. I'll take it back." And he said, "I." That was it for him when he listened to that record. He knew he was a huge Waits fan. Well, listen, how did the Jim White
Yeah.
connection happen for you, and what was it like making a record with him?
The connection kind of happened. I was a big fan of his music, and you know, the Wrong Eyed Jesus record um got me through like one of the worst times in my life, and kind of right after that chapter kind of wrapped up, um I um I like kind of stalked him, you know, and added him on like Facebook and stuff like that, and I posted a song called Swan Dive, which was on the Shadowland album, and he just like commented on it, being like, "Wow, this is an incredible song." So I was like, I had a whole list of producers on because I'd worked with Scott Nolan on the record before, but we were both like kind of doing it to get producing it together, and I never really worked with a producer, in the sense, the kind of classic sense of a producer, and I was just like, I had a list, and he was the number one on the list already, and so I was like, man, fuck it, like I'm just gonna send him a message and ask if he wants to make. I didn't even know if he produced other people's records, and it turns out he's been doing more and more of that, but he hadn't produced a lot of other artists, but I just kind of, and we kind of clicked, and we talked a bunch on the phone, and then decided to make a record.
Very
And
cool. And then what was it like
yeah,
working with him? Yeah.
I mean, it was amazing. Jim White is Jim White all of the time. He's not, you know, he's like a pure artist. He's always Jim White. Like Lucinda Williams, traveling with her, it's like she's always Lucinda Williams. Like she couldn't be anyone else if she wanted to. And Jim White is like that too. And I feel like I learned more from the one record we made together than I learned probably in all the other records I've made. And the one I made with Scott Nolan, I love that record, and Scott is fantastic to work with. Um, and you know, also a real artist. He's who he is all the time.
Hmm.
And but just the way Jim made records is so different from the work process was so different in terms of building a record instead of how I normally go in, which is record almost all of it live, including the vocals, and then add little accoutrements. With Jim, it was like we built everything, um, which honestly gave me a lot of freedom. Um, yeah, and I've been working on this record now that actually I just got the masters back that I recorded at home, played everything on except for fiddle and trumpet. I played all the instruments and uh, tried to put a lot of things into practice that Jim taught me about, soundscapes, and it's got a lot of synth on it. I bought some synth stuff, and that kind of was, I feel like this record not out yet is going to be kind of the proof of concept for like how much was I able to really learn from, because Jim is so singular that you can't imitate him, or you can't, you know,
Hmm.
um, but I hopefully picked up enough from working with him that this new record, comes out.
Did you consider asking him to produce this one as well?
Yeah, I definitely thought about it. And I, if he's down, I definitely am planning on working with him again if he'd be willing to. But for me, it's kind of like every record has to be different from the one before, and um, you know, uh, so I wanted to just take a shot at
Sure.
um, doing one
Yeah.
really rudimentary kind of, or
Uh-huh.
maybe not rudimentary, but you know what I mean, kind of doing it all myself.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll bet Jim was didn't hold back a lot too. I'll bet he was. I started to say opinionated. That's not really the right word because that sounds negative. But I bet he was not shy about giving his input about how you think you should what you should do with particular songs.
Yeah, I mean um, and that's kind of one of the reasons I wanted to work with him because of the pandemic, all these songs I'd written, I'd never really played them live before. And a lot of the songs that by the time it comes to record, I would have been playing, the songs for a year or so live. So they kind of take shape built all around me and my acoustic guitar.
Hmm.
Um, and with Jim, it was like these songs were all written, but they were like the arrangement and the presentation stuff was not solidified. So I was like, okay, at the beginning it was a little, Jim and I were discussing, and he was kind of like, well, the way you want to make it isn't really the way that I make records, blah blah blah. And so like, and we kind of went back and forth, and we were both kind of standing our ground. But then I had this kind of epiphany. I was like, well, I want to make a fucking record with Jim White. So I'm gonna make it the Jim White way. And the worst thing that, I mean, obviously I'm never gonna put something out that I feel like is not representative of me and what I want to
Sure.
do for a record. But I was like, I'm gonna entertain all these things, and he has so many good ideas, and I think that I remember him saying to me, he's like, I've never worked with someone with as many ideas as you. Every now and then, one of them's even good. He's like, uh,
Oh, that's great, man. Well, man,
that's
it's a terrific record. I told you when we were corresponding leading up to this that I'm really enjoying that record a lot. I listened to all your stuff and enjoyed a lot of the kind of the different places you've gone in your is it 4 records you have? Is that right? 4 full length?
yeah, it's well, Midnight in Havana, uh, High Cost Living Strange, Shadowland, and yeah, four.
Yeah. Yeah.
Four that I consider kind of my real records. I have one called Ghostlight that was the first kind of real record I made, and um, but yeah, I kind of consider Midnight in Havana to be kind of my first real record.
When you got done with this record and it actually became, it's coming out and all that, I'm just guessing you were very proud of it and said, yeah, we really made something good this time.
Yeah, yeah, I really, I felt that way in particular about the last two,
Yeah.
Shadowland and Sweet Anhedonia, like where I was. I remember. Well, I just remember thinking like, for better or worse, I made the record I wanted to make,
Yeah.
and I made it how I wanted.
Yeah.
So, that I didn't feel like obviously working with a producer, especially someone like Jim White, there is compromise involved, you know. But it wasn't a compromise in the sense of like, oh, Jim really loves the way this sounds and I hate it, but whatever, we'll put it out.
Right.
It was
Sure.
so at least I can say I made the record I wanted to make. Sounds really how I wanted, how me and Jim wanted it to sound, and we worked really hard on it. So if everyone hates it, like fuck it, because I did what I wanted, and I think most records, if you make a record and you stick with your instincts, then people are gonna dig it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's really nice stuff. How do you play this stuff live? Do you tour much? And when you do you often play with a band, or do you sometimes play with a band? How's it work these days, last year or so?
I mean, I tour a lot, and almost all of it is solo. That's kind of how I always,
Okay.
you know, um, a lot of the artists that I love the most, they kind of, I don't know, in my head as a kid, the archetype of just the lone person out there with their guitar and, showing up at a club and playing is kind of what always seemed the most magical to me. And also, growing up playing in bands, I was kind of over
Yeah.
having to the logistical. I've done like a couple of tours with a band, and when I tour Australia, usually do it with a band of Australian folks, and they'll come out for a lot of the shows, and those they're fun, but
Mhm.
I like playing in other people's bands, but I don't really enjoy. I like to just be up there,
Mhm.
and then if I want to drag a song in a weird direction, I don't have to worry about.
Mhm.
I don't have to write a set list, and you know, uh, I think you can really lyrically connect with people when you're just up there with one instrument, or maybe like a duo that is hard when because when I play with a band, I want it to be like a loud kind of rock and roll,
Mhm.
doomy kind of thing, and which can be fun, but also, a lot of stuff gets lost in the ether that way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost all context. I mean, if you're going to play a listening room and you want your songs to be heard, then either a solo or something stripped down is definitely the best way to do
Yeah.
it. Like like a lot of people, I've certainly been in situations where I'm almost playing as approaching it like I'm playing a listening room, but people aren't really listening. And then you wish you had a band because at least I can get people moving around. But anyway,
Yeah.
look, man, I've got a bunch of questions for you, and I don't want to take too much of your time. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is your sobriety. I saw recently you post on social media that you've been sober for 6 years. Is that right?
So I've been sober from alcohol for 6 years. It's been a few years less with total sobriety.
Hmm.
But
California sobriety, is it sometimes called?
no, I mean I don't uh partake in any mind altering
Okay.
substances anymore. But it's like drinking was always what I felt like was the worst thing for me. And I mean it was, and also one of my earliest kind of loves. I started drinking 12, 13 years old and was immediately kind of a degenerate drunk, wasn't able to, drink like a gentleman, as they say. And so kind of when I went to rehab 6 years ago and um, I got sober from everything, and then some other stuff kind of crept in that I never picked up a drink again. Um, you know,
Congratulations, man. That's
Thanks. Yeah, and
it's
the
not
you know
easy.
the no, and the recovery from being totally sober has been great. You know, I hope to never go down that path again.
Well, it can be really hard as a performer of any kind, especially if you spent years performing under the influence, which I'm sure you did. And do you remember those first few shows that you were totally sober for, and how hard was that?
I mean, I don't know. Getting sober was very hard for me. People who say that it was easy, I believe them. For some people, I'm sure it was, but for me, it was not. So performing sober was kind of weird at first, but it quickly became, the gigs are much better. Because again, I was a sloppy drunk. I wasn't like
Yeah, yeah,
Keith Richards sipping on a beer backstage and then going out, like
right.
elegantly wasted. I was just kind of a nuisance. And the shows were never had a couple of really good full band shows when I was like under the influence of various substances. And it just clicked, but I don't think I ever played a good uh solo show when I was, blackout drunk.
Yeah,
And I would just go on weird tangents, get in arguments with the audience, walk off stage, just generally kind of, fucking up. And then the better the opportunity, the more of a fuck up I was, kind of, I don't know if there was some kind of level of self-sabotage there or what, but it was like the bigger the opportunity, the more fun it was for me to blow it.
wow. Some really interesting stories about Towns Van Zandt in that regard, for sure. Sad stories. Did you see this thing that
Yeah,
happened with Perry Farrell recently, where he got in a
I
fight?
did. I did. You know, I don't want to be a 65-year-old guy wasted on stage, can't sing, trying to fight my bandmates, like that stuff was fun to get into physical altercation with your bandmates when you're like a teenager, or in your early 20s, but it gets pretty depressing and like, you know, I don't think any addict is pathetic, but you behave in a pathetic way. I know I did, and like, you know, I don't think any addict, once you're really cognizant of the fact that you're an addict, I don't think any addict really enjoys being that person.
Right.
It's a very difficult. So
Yeah,
like when I see something like with the Perry Farrell thing, it's like at first it's like, well, you have that knee jerk like, well, what a moron. Like this guy's they finally got this, and I'm not a big James Addiction fan, but like like I think I was way too young, and by the time I was like 11, 12, 13 years old, like they were long gone, so they kind of weren't I mean, but so were Nirvana, and you know, they were a huge influence on me, but somehow that music never really connected with me. And so you have that instinct to be like, oh, what an idiot, you know, but then you're like, well, this guy's clearly sick, you know,
Yeah, that's
and
right. That's right. Yeah,
caught up in the morass of that. So, but it's a good incentive to like not be that guy, you know,
yeah,
and like the thing with Towns, you know, like in my teens and early 20s, you know, I idolized him. You know, he was a huge part of I think Jimi Hendrix and Towns were like the two most mind-blowing musical discoveries of my life, you know, and um, but then you get a little older and then you look at it more critically and you're like, well, this guy didn't even put out like one record the last 20 years of his life. It's just kind of, you know, like it's tragic, you
yeah,
know, and the pain that he must have been in and the pain that it caused people who cared about him. And,
yeah.
you know, you know, it's not what I want for myself. And,
Right,
um, again, it's one thing when you're 20 and you're idolizing Towns. It's another thing when you are
right.
in your 30s and you're still stuck in that kind of arrested development stage. And then you kind of get sober and you realize like no one cares. Like no one, if you're out there fucking everything up, like people aren't going to care about you down the line. They're not going to be like, oh, what a tortured genius. It's like they're probably just not, no one's going to know who you are.
Yeah,
And you're just going to be embarrassing yourself.
yeah. And I think you really touched on something with the or the self-sabotage thing. I think that happens a lot. You saw that in Anton in Brian Jonestown Massacre. I don't
Yeah,
know. Did you see that film?
I did. Yeah, dig.
So sad. Kind of funny in a way, but not really. Hey, let me change gears here. One thing that I wanted to ask you about, put you on the spot a little bit here. You in your website, you have a quote from Carl Jung, which I just completely love. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and it will and you will call it fate. Um, Fantastic quote. Maybe before I ask you a question about it, let me just ask you why is that quote particularly salient for you that you would put it on your website?
I mean, it kind of, I put a Carl Jung quote on my website for the release before, and you know, you know, I have you know, I see a Jungian therapist, and just a lot of stuff you said has always really connected me, especially about the unconscious and the shadow self. Um, it's actually that quote on my website, I think is a quote that's been attributed to him, but like it might be a like the quote attributed
Ah,
to him might be a slight misquote or but it's one that um has been attributed to him and seems to be something he said, but it's
it makes sense for him. I mean,
yeah, and it doesn't mean it doesn't resonate with me, you know? Like
totally.
it's
Yeah.
and I didn't want to not attribute it to him and then people think that I came up with this
Right.
genius quote,
Right.
you know, so I was like, well, gonna attribute, you know, like my dad would always say, like, it doesn't have to be true to be funny, or it doesn't have to be true to be good, you know?
Doesn't have to be
Um,
factual to be true. Yeah.
yeah.
So, but let me ask you the question though. The question is how? How do we make the unconscious conscious to avoid the unconscious directing our life? How do we do that?
I mean, you have to, in my experience, you have to watch for signs. You have to like really do a lot of the internal work, you know, looking at the parts. You know, when I've taught songwriting workshops, I always say like, find the things you hate the most about yourself and double down on them because, you know, that's what, you know, because we all like everyone wants to be a you know, iconoclast and everyone wants to be, but like really, we also have this paradoxical desire to fit in, you know, and I think that, um, you know, the things about us artists that kind of we think are distasteful or unpalatable are often the things that we only feel that way because we feel it makes you feel like a freak because you're like, oh, well, there's not really context for this part of myself, so I'm just going to push it down. But like, really, that's the reason it makes you feel like a freak is because it's the part that makes you very unique, you know, and you got to double down on that. And that's a big part of the kind of shadow self, the unconscious, you know, and you got to dig, right? Because
Yeah.
um, there's like a good Jungian meditation about the digging thing where you kind of dig into your subconscious and then these creatures will come and talk to you or confront you and you just have to, you know, listen to them and speak to them and, you know, acknowledge them. And I think that, you know, anybody, people who don't acknowledge their shadow are dangerous people, not just for themselves, but for everyone around them, you
Yeah.
know, and that's not a critique of those people. And like, I'm not saying they're deliberately nefarious bad actors, but that doesn't change the objective truth, which I think is those people are dangerous, and I don't want to be one of those people.
Yeah. Amen to that. I will say that for me, meditation has been probably the most important thing that helped me make the unconscious conscious,
Oh yeah.
especially meditation retreats. After 3 or 4 days of silence and alternating walking, sitting, and eating meditation, you're gonna that unconscious stuff is gonna bubble up whether you like it or
Mhm.
not. Have you
Yep.
ever done anything like that? Have you ever done any long meditation retreats?
No, I've always wanted to. I've always wanted to do a silent meditation retreat, and it's maybe I'll do that in 2025. Maybe that's going to be I don't really do New Year's resolutions, but not because I think I'm too good for them. I just don't think it's I think I just don't think it's good for me to
Mhm.
you know, but I do have like goals for, you know, that I try to set myself in general and give myself a time frame to try to complete them.
Mhm.
And I think that doing a silent retreat has been something I've always wanted to do. But a lot of them are so expensive. You know, like I'm a musician. I don't,
Ah,
you know,
yeah,
there are ones that are affordable, you know. So I need to, you know, again, I need to stop making excuses and just do it.
well let me give some unsolicited advice there.
Yeah, please.
This works better if you've had instruction, certainly, and I've had a lot of meditation teachers, and I've been meditating for probably 50 years,
Oh, wow.
but I think you can do it anyway. You can do a self retreat where you literally find a cabin, even a hotel room. I did one in middle of Austin one weekend where I brought food. I shut myself in a hotel room. I turned off the phone, did not turn on the TV, did not write, did not play music.
Oh,
I
you didn't write during it or anything?
Nope. No, on a meditation retreat, I mean, there's many ways to do it, but one of the, I think, most advisable ways, you don't write, you don't speak, I mean, you can, if obviously if you need to, and you don't get, really hardcore where you can't even ask someone to pass the salt or something, but you typically are sitting, if there's other people involved, you're not even making eye contact and you're staying to yourself. But you can do it in a hotel room, man. You can do it someplace where it's not, you can do it in your home as long as you can be alone for a period of time, take care of this, the structure ahead of time in terms of having food and having a plan and just being alone with your mind for a couple of days is incredible. It's hard, but it's incredible because you want to pick up that phone. Even if you think you don't have an unhealthy relationship with your phone, you sit there, you sit by yourself doing nothing for 3 or 4 hours, and your mind wants to do something, man. It wants to go
Oh
outside.
yeah.
It wants to grab that phone. So, and that's instructive in itself to kind of watch how the mind wants to do that. But anyway, man,
Yeah, and you have to acknowledge those things about yourself. You know, you can tell yourself you don't have an unhealthy relationship with your phone, but like
yeah,
try sitting in the room without it for 24 hours and
that's
see,
right.
you know, and again, you know, a lot of people, probably myself included, don't really want to find that out. But
Yeah, that's right.
you
Well,
know,
listen,
again, that's part of confronting your
I,
shadow.
I feel like we could talk for 2 hours easily, but I do like to keep these things at 45, 50 minutes. So let me ask you a couple more questions. I want to ask you a little bit about lyrics, about lyric writing. Um, you've had a lot of great press. No Depression mentions your way with words. And man, you don't win the Kerrville New Folk Competition, which you did in 2016, without having excellent lyrics. I'm wondering how you, and we've talked a little bit about poetry, how you go about writing lyrics, if there's any particular way or if it varies every time, and how do you stay objective about it? This is too many questions to answer, but do you try to tell a story, or do you try to leave a lot open for your reader? How do you approach lyrics in general? Maybe just talk for a few minutes about how you approach writing song lyrics.
I mean, I think when you said tell a story or leave things open, I think part of telling a story is leaving certain things open. So I think they're one and the same, or part of the whole thing, right? I think that, it's I don't know. I feel like, and I know probably a lot of people disagree, but I think you're born a writer or you're not, and it goes to songwriting, and it's on you to become a better songwriter and put
Mm,
in the hour,
mm,
be open to everything, and but and I think that comes down to instincts, and I think that you live and die by your instincts as a songwriter, and big part of that is knowing when a song is done versus believing, telling yourself that a song is done and believing it.
mm,
It's
mhm.
like when a song, and Lucinda and I were talking about this the other night, how some songs, there's songs that I put on records that have taken me 5, 6 years of constant writing to finish, and same with her, and um, I think that like the only way to know when that song is done is you instinctually know, like, okay. And for me, it's like when I tell a story, I don't really ever set out to write a song about anything in particular. Usually, like you said, a line will come and I'll just um you know kind of go from there or work backwards, and sometimes that line comes out. I remember a friend of mine she's a great poet, and she's told me this thing, and I'm not sure if she came up with it or heard it from someone, but how some song lines in a song, or in her example was with a poem, are like bay leaves. You put them into the sauce and then you take them out, and oftentimes,
Mm,
like, the line that I'll start out with won't end up making it into the final song because the song will go in a different direction. And again, you have to instinctually know this is where the song wants to go. I can't force it to go in my direction or else it's going to suck. It's never going to work. Like, you just got to follow
mhm.
the song, and that's instinctual, and also, but the editing process is obviously a
Right.
craft of where
Yeah.
that song comes from. Like, if I knew where it came from, I'd go there every day, and I'd
Sure.
write, hundreds
Sure.
of great songs, and I don't know where they come from. And I think that's, I don't, it's great. It's like he talks about the negative capability and things like that. And I think, Rilke and a lot of other people. And I think that it's cool to have the questions like, where does the song come from? But
Um,
not expect the answer. And, you know, uh, for me, I don't even think I'd want to know, you know?
well, it comes from the unconscious, man. I mean,
Yeah.
it has to, right? I mean, it comes from the air, it comes from the culture, it comes from the collective unconscious, I think.
Collective
And
unconscious.
and
Yeah.
isn't that so cool? Again, this feels a little cliche, but it's so cool how it can be either song lyrics, or it can even be a problem you're working on, some issue maybe you're having with your life or something. And when you least suspect it, you're in the shower with her and you go, oh, there it is. I really
Yeah.
think that's nothing more than the unconscious has been working on this problem. And you
Yeah.
finally got in a state of mind where it bubbles up.
Yeah. And you have to know, you have to be ready when it does,
Yeah.
and you have to follow your instincts in terms of, like, okay, is that something, um, what does that mean? Where does that come from?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
what do I do with it?
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I mean, it comes from collective unconscious, it comes from your subconscious. But, where does it come from before that? Like, I don't know,
Yeah.
but I think it's like you've got to be prepared for it. And I think the secret to that is try to be constantly writing, so you can be like a finely tuned antenna for it. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Nice. So I did read somewhere that you read On the Road when you were 19 and it had a profound impact on you. I guess first question, is that right? Did I get that right?
Yeah, no, that's correct. Yeah.
And I read that it also had a huge impact on me. I read it a little bit earlier than 19. Um, but maybe just ask you in a nutshell, do you remember why was it so impactful to you?
I read it when I was living in Cuba, so I was 19, far away from things I've been used to, a
Mm,
country where,
mm,
I had to learn the language. And it just felt like kind of it dovetailed really nicely with, and it's one of the few books that I read and then immediately started back at the beginning and read it again. But I think it's also one of those books that you kind of got to read. The world is full of, you know, morons who didn't, not morons, but people who didn't read. Um, it's not moronic to not read On the Road until you're in your 30s, but it's moronic to try to take on that persona of like the Neil Cassidy or Jack Kerouac,
mm,
when you're, if you read it for the first time in your 30s and you make it a big part of your personality. Whereas like I think when you read it, or if you read it in your 30s and you can kind of see the less uh I don't know, it can't mean the same to someone who reads it in full adulthood when
right.
you're an impressionable kid, and you're just like, oh wow, this is, you know, I'm really glad I read it when I did. And I mean, I think that my trajectory in life was not necessarily altered by reading it. Um, but I think it just, for whatever it's worth, had a profound effect on me at that age.
Yeah, me too, man. One of the things that I will say I've read it. I'm in my 60s. I probably read it when I was in my 40s. Uh, and one of the things it really surprised me. I I realized how much I imposed on that book. And I saw Jack as the Neil Cassidy character, and so much of that book is really pretty sedate and chill, and it's not this mad, this thing we associate with the Beats and Neil Cassidy and the jazz at the time and the jazz clubs and all that. I mean, that's there, but so much of that book is just about him by himself, traveling across the country,
Yeah.
reflecting on what he saw, and it's not quite the wild ride, I guess I would say, that I thought it was when I read it as a kid. It it definitely had an impact on me the next time I read it, but in a different kind of way. I could see, for example, a lot of Kerouac stuff was influenced by Thomas Wolfe, and I didn't
Yeah.
see that the first time I read On the Road, but I saw it the second time that I read it, later on in life. Anyway, what are some other books that you call to mind that maybe you've read that, or authors that have had an impact on you?
I mean, definitely kind of the usual Flannery O'Connor, you know, um, you know, I mean, Cormac McCarthy is huge. Louise Erdrich is one of my favorite authors. She's fantastic. You know, I really like everything I read by Carson McCullers is great.
Yeah,
Toni Morrison's definitely one of my all-time favorites, and I like the Russians too, the Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and
sure.
um, Gogol and those folks are great. I mean, I feel like I don't know, every book I read, I feel like I get something out of it. Um, and I really kind of never want to put down a book if I I'm not enjoying it. It's the same with a song. Like I always want to write a song until it's finished, even if I know while I'm working hard, like this is objectively not a good song. That you might get one line out of that song that
Yeah, that's true.
jump off into some, and I feel the same with books. There's some books like that I've really kind of felt like a slog to get through, but then they've resonated with me in a way that I couldn't have expected. And I've never regretted finishing a book, you know?
Yeah, there's a discipline factor there that I think is important that you stick with it, and it's
Yeah.
it's same with you say it's same with songwriting. Sometimes when you don't think it's going well, you stick with it, and something good will come of it, even if it's not that song.
Yeah.
I really love the Steve Earle quote, and I probably will have it a little bit wrong, but it's basically you can't write if you don't read. And it's
Yeah.
I don't understand people who tell me they're songwriters and they don't read. I mean, I'm sure you can do it, but that baffles me.
Yeah.
So let's see a couple more questions, man. If here's the kind of the deserted island question, and I'll frame it a little differently. If you can only listen to one record for the next month, what would that record be?
Um, Man, that's a good question. Um, Maybe I don't know. There's a record by they're a metal band called Mastodon that I love them, and they got a record called Crack the Sky. It came out I think about 10, 15 years ago. That would be one of them. The first Warren Zevon album would be another one. Um, Really any.
I would not expect someone who put out Sweet Anhedonia to list Mastodon, but that just shows how
Oh
eclectic
yeah.
you are, man.
I mean, I'm a huge, I grew up loving metal and punk rock and stuff like that. And in fact, the new album I've been working on is me trying to kind of bridge that gap between my love of like doom metal and
Nice,
my love of like folk songwriter type stuff.
cool.
So I think, yeah, those would be kind of off the top of my head. Maybe, I mean, honestly, any of Jimi Hendrix's albums. My favorite is Axis Bold as Love. So that, or maybe Judy Silt's first record. It's another great one. Um, that was I would always play that to my daughter when she was a little baby. We'd go to sleep listening to that.
Nice.
She, even at 3 years old, she'd just be doing the little ooh at the back of the car and singing along to it, and she's very musical. So, yeah, those are the top of my head. Um,
Nice. Nice.
yeah,
I can still remember, I can visualize it, even what the room looked like the first time I heard Hendrix.
me too.
It was in Kevin O'Grady's bedroom. I was in seventh grade, and he put this album on, and I just went, "What is that?
Yeah, yeah.
What is that?" But I was compelled. Uh, okay, what are you listening to now? What maybe is on your playlist right now that you've been listening to lately?
Um, it's a good question. Hold on, let me take a look
And
at
I
what
know
I've been
you did
listening
say
to.
you read more than you listen to stuff.
Yeah, I've been listening to this band called that I've all been a big fan of for a long time. But been listening to them a lot lately. Poison Idea. They're like they're from Portland, came out like the '80s punk rock kind of hardcore band of that's my most recent
Okay.
listen to. Let me
And you
give
said
you
Poison Idea?
yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I've also been listening to the Sharon Van Etten, her newest record.
Hmm.
Um, Yeah, those are the two most recent things. Looking at
Okay.
my Spotify that I've been
Yeah, right on.
listening to a lot of.
Just a couple more questions. And this is one of those questions you could think about for a long time and have a lot of different answers, but just what comes to mind. One of the most memorable shows you've ever attended.
Leonard Cohen at the Royal Albert Hall.
Wow. When
Yeah.
was the man? When was that?
Um, I must have been like 20, I guess. Um, yeah, that's the first one that comes to mind.
Lucky you. Um,
Right.
who are some of the folks that you've shared a stage with that you've opened for or have shared a stage with one way or another that I might know?
I mean, probably a bunch, but one of my favorite. I had a few shows opening for Robert Earl Keen, and I've always been a huge fan of his. It's weird. I've always felt like his songs remind me of like Chekhov stories. Something about his,
Yeah.
he feels like the most Russian American songwriter, just in like his characters and the way he frames story. I don't know why. I've just always felt like he's like the, country Americana version of Chekhov.
I think he would love
Um,
that, by the way. I don't know if you've told him that, but I think he would dig that for sure.
no, I didn't. I never told him that. Yeah, you know,
If you get a chance, if you run into him, you should. Who's someone that
yeah,
you've not shared a stage with realistically? We're not going to bring Jimi Hendrix back to life, but
right.
somebody that if you got a phone call tonight and said, "Hey, I've got a couple shows coming up and I'd love to have you open up," who's somebody that comes to mind that you would say, "Hell yes."
Probably Nick Cave.
Hmm.
I've been a huge Nick Cave fan for a long time. Um, you know, he's the one off the top of my head. Yeah,
All right, pet peeves. What pisses you off?
cheap people, cheapness.
Okay.
And I don't mean frugality. I mean people who are cheap in spirit. People
Uh,
who are shitty tippers, or people who Venmo requests you $3 for coffee, or people who just aren't generous with their time and their knowledge. And I feel like that's my biggest pet peeve. And I've never met someone who's cheap who's not a shitty person in other
right.
ways. It's like a tip of the iceberg thing. It's like cheap, and then underneath it's like, this morass of other shitty qualities. And I've never met anyone who's generous who's not an all around good person, you
Yeah,
know?
man, that's a really good point. I think people who are generous materially tend to be generous of spirit as well, and vice
Oh
versa.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, man. Last question. Do you have any particular guiding philosophy or spirituality that you lean on when, especially when times are tough?
I mean, again, like for me, it's just questioning things and not expecting an answer,
Hmm.
and trying to remind myself that, like Tom Petty said, all the things I worry never happen anyway,
Yeah,
and um,
yeah,
so, those kind of things, and trying to get outside of myself and be of service. I don't subscribe to any religion per se, but I do believe in a higher power, and I do believe that, and that's not saying like a higher power necessarily guiding my life, but just
right.
something much bigger than
Yeah,
any of us are able to comprehend, and just, yeah, I think not expecting any answers, but asking anyway, and hoping,
that's
and
beautiful.
you know,
Yeah, man, that's great. There, the 12-step program really is great, and it really makes sense even for people who are not alcoholics. And that
oh
12th
yeah, I
step, the
agree.
12th step is, I mean, you alluded to it there, be of service and get out of your
Yeah.
own head and your own shit and be of service to someone. That's really huge. Well, man, thank you so much for doing this. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Dude, thank you.
I'll put the link to your website in the show notes, and encourage everyone to listen to your music. It's available on Spotify and all the other streaming services as well. I don't think you have any gigs coming up anytime soon, but I'll pay attention to that because I'd love to catch one of your shows if I possibly can.
Yeah, I don't have any. I've got a handful of like kind of one-off gigs here and there, but I don't have any real concrete touring. I don't really have any touring for the rest of the year. It's pretty much just gonna go home and try to spend as much time with my daughter as possible and figure out, you know, with my label about what we're gonna do for releasing the new record.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that, man. Hey, thank you again, and hope
Thank
to
you.
catch you down the road sometime. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
You bet,
Talk
man.
to you
Take
soon.
care.